Now it's that time of the week again where we have a look at the international diplomatic scene with our resident expert in the studio. It's time to have a chat with Ambassador Yunyo Cho here for the end of the year. Yeah? Did you have a good Christmas, Ambassador?
I think I did. Stayed inside. It was so cold in Seoul.
Yeah, no doubt. The difference between Seoul and Gwangju is ridiculous as far as winter goes, doesn't it? All I can say is it's probably not the best time of the year to be in Pyongyang, that's for sure. I imagine it's absolutely blistering cold up there. But the year's gone. 2021's gone already. Time
does fly.
It does, yeah. So what are we talking about for this last show of the year?
Well, a lot has been happening in the international arena this year. Particularly, COVID-19 refuses to disappear from us, changing its form into different variants now with the Omicron after Delta. But today, I would like to talk about the two potential trouble spots for the United States, which is an issue that wouldn't go away but stay with us in different forms, like COVID-19.
Yes, so it is going to be an interesting year ahead on the diplomatic scene for sure, and the US always has a lot to think about internationally, doesn't it? So what are we talking about then?
Well, it is so-called the two-world strategy that the U.S. government has maintained for the last 30 years. After the end of the Cold War in 1991, the United States didn't have to prepare for an all-out war with the Soviet Union, which didn't exist anymore. Then the most likely threat of war that required the United States' attention and involvement came from the Middle East or in East Asia, which is the Korean Peninsula. So it has been the policy of the United States government to keep the capacity to deal with contingencies on those two spots simultaneously.
Right. It is an interesting issue for the Americans. So then why does it matter now? Why does it still matter?
Well, now the United States is facing two potential military conflicts in Ukraine and Taiwan, not the Middle East and Korea. So why? Russia and China are threatening to invade those countries as their own territories. Russia has recently amassed huge forces on the border with Ukraine, and the U.S. and its NATO allies regard this posture as prelude to an impending invasion. On the other side, China has traditionally claimed Taiwan as one of its provinces and vowed to unify with it by force if necessary. But it has recently been showing more aggressive attitude, like its recent violation of Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And with the confidence of China running high, many pundits predict that China will attempt to conquer Taiwan sooner or later.
Right, and this is obviously an interesting one because it would put Xi Jinping as probably the most important Chinese leader since we're talking about Mao Zedong or Xiaoping. Right. It would put him on that level, wouldn't it? But we'll go back first and talk about this very interesting development in Eastern Europe and the relationship between Russia and the Ukraine, yeah?
Right. Historically, Russia and Ukraine have been, one way or another, inseparably close, but legally separate now. There was a Principality of Kiev in the Middle Age, but mostly Ukraine has been part of the Russian Empire as well as of the Soviet Union until its independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And the former republics of USSR are now loosely held together as CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. And when the United Nations was created in 1945, Stalin insisted that all his 16 republics get the separate votes in the General Assembly. It was totally absurd.
Right.
But the West somehow decided to give three votes, including Ukraine and Belarus. So this shows some evidence of separate identity of Ukraine. And at the time of separation in 1991, Russia was busy working on its own survival with the sagging economy and didn't mind too much of letting go of a burdensome neighbor.
Right. It is an interesting one because you mentioned earlier, there are certain parts of the Ukraine that are predominantly Russia, and we've seen them play out in Crimea and the Donbass regions, which are predominantly Russian regions, showing that history, but they were sort of very, very easily given away in the 1920s by Lenin to make Ukraine a little bit bigger, but also not much really happened in the way of Russia trying to get that back after the Cold War. So what's changed now then? It's obviously down to Putin, yeah?
Right. So after year 2000, Putin has solidified his power by tapping the Russian people's nationalism and their nostalgia on superpower status of USSR. And now Russia is claiming Ukraine again as part of Russia. Particularly in February 2014, a pro-Russian Ukraine president, Yanukovych, was ousted from power as a result of violent protests by Ukrainian people called Maidan Revolution. Then in Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, where you said many Russians already stayed there, so there were pro-Russian unrest. And there were also appearance of Russian troops without insignia. So this led to practically a civil war in Ukraine. Then there was another Russian move, which was an annexation of Crimea with the passing of a referendum at the local parliament under the pressure of Russian military, which was already capturing that region. So since then, Russia has been under sanctions by the West, but they held on to Crimea and continue to influence the eastern Ukraine. Now, Putin has put some 100,000 Russian soldiers on the border and demanded that Washington guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO and that the alliance will refrain from certain military activities around Ukrainian territory.
Right. This is an interesting one because just to take the Putin perspective here, this was something that was discussed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that Russia would be still given its so-called sphere of influence, and the Ukraine being a territory that borders Russia directly would be sort of left alone by the West. But the Ukrainians themselves in many places have started to move towards the West and want to join things like the EU or even NATO. But why is Putin putting all of this into the Ukraine? It is risking a flaring up of hostilities, yeah?
Right. During the Cold War, you may remember the potential battlefield between the West and East, the NATO forces and Warsaw Pact forces, was Germany.
Yes.
So that was the main focus of the conflict. But after the Cold War, these East European countries, which used to be satellites of the Soviet Union, now joined NATO as well as European Union as their path to freedom, prosperity, and security now against Russia.
Right.
Their former master, but the new threat. So NATO has accommodated all those wishes and now recently recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine as aspiring members. But by this process, Russia has not only lost the former buffer states against the West, but also is about to face its immediate neighbors or former republics, Ukraine and Georgia, joining the other side.
Right. That is an interesting one. Yeah.
So they are getting very much frustrated and scared. So Putin is now trying to draw a line that the West should not cross, and demanding that the West respect the Russian sphere of influence, as you said.
And this is the thing about Putin, isn't it? That Putin came to power in Russia when Russia was so weak and Russian people were seeing the West sort of take advantage of Russia's weakness. So that's why he still gets a lot of support for these sort of actions, because the Russians do naturally believe, as most superpowers do, that they're entitled to a sphere of influence. But then what is the response from the US government and the West in general?
Well, there are competing interpretations about what has happened. Some say that it was the NATO's eastern move, but the Western people see it as Eastern European countries moving to the West.
Yes.
But still, to resolve this crisis, Biden has said the United States and the West would put economic sanctions like trade and financial restrictions on Russia, but ruled out the possibility of direct military intervention. However, NATO has alerted its rapid deployment forces of 40,000 troops ready to be put on the ground. So military tension is also on the rise. And recently, the United States and Russia announced that they would start a negotiation on this issue from next month. And Putin confirmed this negotiation in his own press conference, but he still insisted that the West should not bother Russia on its backyard. I personally hope that there had been some behind-the-curtain negotiation for a deal that would save face as well as give some assurances to both sides. However, the military buildup still continues, in part to strengthen their hands at the upcoming negotiations. So we will see.
We'll have to keep our eyes on that one in the new year. Now, we'll move across here to this sphere of the world and China and the recent upping of the ante and its possible intentions to really push the buttons on Taiwan. How do you see that play out?
Well, we all remember that the Chinese Civil War of 1949 pushed the Kuomintang to the island of Taiwan. And the United States kept its distance with the mainland communist China until Nixon's visit in 1972, which was a paradigm shift on the global strategic balance. With the Shanghai Communique of that year, the United States and PRC declared the One China policy, opened up their dialogue, and later established diplomatic relations in 1979. At the same time, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act for the United States to continue to provide necessary means for Taiwan's defense. So the strategic ambiguity under the unnatural combination of One China policy and Taiwan Relations Act remained in place to keep peace in this region until now. Meanwhile, the United States welcomed China to the world with Deng Xiaoping, particularly after the end of Cold War, as major partner for global peace and prosperity, which led to China's rapid growth.
Yeah, so they did get a lot out of that, that sort of coming in from the cold, as they'd say. And what happened then to create these recent changes?
Well, the recent rise of China and its increasing assertiveness made pundits predict a conflict between those G2 is inevitable. While Americans complain about unfair competition from China and American policymakers are wary of the Chinese challenge to the U.S. global dominance, the Chinese contempt for the U.S. inefficacy in dealing with financial or pandemic crises, as well as democratic chaos, particularly under Trump, made them think that the time is on their side. So now President Xi extends his term beyond 10 years of his predecessors, and now he may need to show his mettle with his determination to unify the country with Taiwan. And Xi has also claimed East Asia and the West Pacific, including Korea, I remember, as China's sphere of influence.
Right, that is an interesting part of it, isn't it? How then is the US going to respond, do you think, in this case?
Well, the beauty of the strategic ambiguity was to keep China guessing whether the United States will really come to Taiwan's rescue in case of its invasion. Now, China is increasingly testing the nerve of the United States, and the United States, as was shown by the recent remark by President Biden, is losing its temper as well as ambiguity and talk about its readiness for confrontation with China over Taiwan. Both sides are building up their military installations in the area. The problem is that the odds are not so good for the United States. for a conflict near China, as China has actively beefed up its military capability to neutralize the United States aircraft carrier fleet in its own region with its new missiles and other latest technologies.
Yeah, it's. Nobody's going to get. China is not Iraq. China is not Afghanistan. China is a legitimate, the most legitimate threat to the United States militarily since the old USSR. So that begs the question, because the Americans and the Soviets never went into a direct land war or even a sea war because it was so ambiguous as to who would win. We even had the idea that both of them would lose. So will this really happen? And what would be the significance of such an event?
Well, let's look at the history. In 1956, the United Kingdom, France, and Israel attempted to take the Suez Canal from Egypt by force and failed. Why? Due to the opposition from the United States.
Right.
And historians say that this Suez Crisis of 1956 marked the end of the British Empire. And famous British historian Neil Ferguson grimly predicted that a potential U.S. defeat over Taiwan will be its own Suez moment as the end of U.S. dominance over East Asia, if not the whole world. Well, Russia and China may not conspire with each other to put the United States into a corner, but one needs to be prepared for a worst-case scenario. The United States is working with its allies all over the world to convince those two authoritarian regimes not to make wrong moves. And those events will have impacts on our own security and economy of Korea. The price of LNG imported into Korea has tripled due to the Russian maneuver to put pressure on Europe by blocking its gas pipeline to Europe. And of course, any contingency around Taiwan will also have immediate impact on us. So we should be prepared to protect our own interests and values.
Yeah, it is an interesting situation developing here in East Asia for sure. I tell you what, it's one of those things, isn't it? You got a point there. If the US is on the decline, then it will be in places like the Ukraine and Taiwan where we starkly see their inability to hold on to the global hegemony that they've
That'll be an inflection point of the history then.
Definitely. And what was the old curse they said? May you live in interesting times. Well, apparently we are very much living in interesting times at the moment. Thank you for trying to clarify that for us, Ambassador Yoon. I hope you have a fantastic new year.
Yeah, and I have one last-minute book recommendation today.
Yep.
The 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, released the Korean version of his memoir, Resolved, or in Korean, 결단의 시간들. This will be a good read for our listeners to learn about his achievement at the world body, his leadership, and his philosophy. So enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. We'll catch up with you in 2022.
See you in the new